Hello, I'm Nareh Eshgian, and I worked on a grant these last few months with Dr. Hung. The presentation that I'm about to give is called Oral Cardiovascular and Respiratory Effects of E-Cigarettes, Synthesis of Literature, and it's kind of the background information and the source of where a lot of that grant material came from. So this was kind of just like the process of finding the information and putting it together. So I'll be presenting on a lot of the findings that stood out as we were doing the synthesis. So just to give like a quick introduction, e-cigarettes were introduced into the US as kind of like a different method for smoking cessation, and in a sense marketed so that it would be like for the benefit of the public. Ever since its introduction back in 2006, 2007, the tobacco industry has like really boomed, and sales for vapes and e-cigarettes have really soared up into like the $6 billion range. That's how much the current market value is for e-cigarettes. And at the same time that these e-cigarettes hit the market and were being advertised as an alternative to smoking conventional cigarettes to adults, they were also being marketed to the younger generation, the young adults, the high school kids, teenagers, as like a cool and like fun way to get into smoking that isn't as bad for you as conventional smoking would be. But the problem is that there really is no research on the long-term effects. So even though it may seem as though this is a good alternative to smoking conventional cigarettes, there is not really any proof that down the line this isn't going to turn into a bigger problem. So some background information on the tobacco industry in the US over the last like couple hundred years. Back in the 1700s, they had the cigar and like snuff products that people were using, and that was like convenient when people were, battling in war. They could just be chewing on some tobacco or smoking a cigar. Pipes were also very popular. But in the 1800s, they started to invent machines to roll cigarettes, and that's really when like the mass production of cigarettes took off, and that became the more popular method of smoking for a very, very long time. And then, of course, in the 1960s, the Surgeon General put out a report saying that tobacco is, really bad for you, really bad for our health. And down the line, airplanes pretty much just like stopped allowing the use of cigarettes because like back in the day you could smoke on an airplane. And then they started to put the warnings on the cartons, and smoking in public became illegal. So they started to really regulate by law how much the tobacco industry could be doing. And then in the 2000s, around 2006 really, the tobacco industry came up with the e-cigarette, and that was kind of like a revival for the tobacco industry as like conventional cigarettes were starting to decline in use. So what we did for this project was a PubMed search to find, relevant articles. And what we were really looking for was anything that said e-cigarettes or vaping, which is, a vape is another term for an e-cigarette, e-valley, electronic cigarettes, just like any one of those like different variations really. And we got about 98 research articles that we found would be useful for our project, that were within like the realm of like what we were looking for. And within these articles, 57 of them were about rats and 2 of them were about mice. What we really wanted was US focused research, but it turned out to be very difficult to find that. So a lot of it was actually South Korea, Japan, China, or even like England. But a lot of that research also was from the tobacco companies themselves. So it was really hard to kind of filter out like what, would be useful or didn't have a lot of conflict of interest related to it. But the main categories of what we were looking for were essentially either physical health effects or more like social, mental, behavioral. So what we did was we looked at the oral cavity, cardiovascular system, respiratory system, and then everything else was kind of either like general or really about, you know, how often, who was smoking, what was more popular among like female versus male or different age groups. But this review was really good in the sense that it showed why we need more of these research projects to be conducted in the US, because we really do lack a lot of e-cigarette related research. So what we found was that the median age of these E-Valley survivors was about 23, and the median age of those that were dying from it was 45. And just to like give a note about E-Valley, this was back in 2019 when, you know, teenagers all of a sudden were becoming hospitalized. And what they found was that these teenagers were using these vape pens, these e-cigarettes, and they found that there were a lot of toxic compounds in there that were causing them to have like severe lung failure and very, very harsh consequences, and they were being hospitalized in large numbers. So when they took a closer look, they found that e-cigarettes can have over 80 different compounds in them, a good chunk of which are, you know, toxins. And you don't necessarily know how much your vape pen is releasing when you're smoking it, how many of those toxins are coming out, how much it's emitting. So like that's going to vary from product, from flavor, from, you know, pen type even. And this goes back to just like a huge lack of knowledge and information about what the long-term effects are going to be. Like the E-Valley situation was just a very short-term situation that came out of nowhere. No one knew what to even call it at the time. And so, you know, this could indicate that there are going to be long-term effects further down the line. But what we do know is from the short-term effects that we have seen so far, there's been an increase in heart rate. There's been lung related issues, acute endothelial dysfunction, oxidative stresses have increased. And a bigger issue would be that, you know, younger adults that weren't smoking before, even like adolescents that weren't smoking before, are more likely to try a conventional cigarette once they've been using an e-cigarette. So just to show some numbers here, this is pretty much the impact of marketing on these like young adults. So back in 2019, the National Youth Tobacco survey was completed in the US, and what they found was that almost 28% of high school students were using e-cigarettes. That's more than a quarter of these high school kids using these vape pens. And close again in number is that more than a quarter of these young adults started using e-cigarettes in 2018, and then they went on to try conventional cigarettes in 2019. Versus just the 2.4% who hadn't ever used an e-cigarette going on to try a conventional cigarette. That's a fairly large discrepancy. And what they found was that the people, the young adults that took this survey, those that were aged between 15 to 20 in 2018 had 3 times higher odds of current e-cigarette users than the respondents who were like age 21 to 27. So these younger teenagers, these younger adults are much more likely to be smoking and to continue smoking. And they found that more than 7% of those that had used e-cigarettes in 2018 were currently still smoking in 2019 versus the less than 1% that like hadn't used a vape pen and started smoking. So that's 7 times more. These kids are 7 times more likely to move on to conventional smoking, to conventional cigarettes, once they've had an e-cigarette, which again is quite a large number, seeing how like these are meant to be smoking cessation aids for adults, but they're really just helping the youth come into the same problem. So here we have just some thoughts, some ideas really. But basically, you know, there are a lot of adverse effects that we have found on oral health, on the respiratory system, on the cardiovascular system. And that's just from like the current research that we have on like these more short-term projects. But really, you know, everyone knows that tobacco isn't good for you. It's really bad for, you know, everyone's health, doesn't matter what age group you're in. So these e-cigarettes are definitely going to require more research so that we know like what these effects are going to be down the line. But what's interesting is that this past year in October, the FDA actually approved the marketing of 3 new tobacco products, and they were 3 different e-cigarette companies. And basically what this means is that these manufacturers have to prove to the FDA that marketing of these products is appropriate and that it's for the protection of the public. It's meant to help inform the public so that they can make, you know, an informed decision at the end of the day. But, you know, these new approvals are kind of like just another reason as to why we need more research on these topics, is so that we know what the potential risks are going to be. Because even though the FDA did approve these 3 new products for marketing, they also stated that we don't really know what the actual benefits are, if there are any, and what the potential risks are going to be. So we need to have further data. We need more information. We need US-based research projects so that we can really get a good picture of what the effect of these e-cigarettes are going to be. So that concludes my project. And I just wanted to thank Dr. Hung and give a quick acknowledgement to the Roseman University College of Dental Medicine, as well as the University of Health Sciences. Thank you.